You can clap at the end. Okay, thank you to the translators. The translators, I've added a few extra slides in just to keep you awake, so I'll let you know when I get to them. Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here. What would be really helpful would be to get an idea of who's in the room. So can everybody hear me all right? This microphone is... Yeah, is that okay?
Speak in the microphone for the translation.
I'm sorry?
You have to speak in the microphone for the translation.
Okay, is that all right? Yeah, okay. So I've got some slides, but we've got an hour, and I think it would be much more interesting if I went through the slides fairly quickly, and then we started our own conversation about where families, and particularly parents, might fit into the work that we all do. So just to get us started, it'd be quite interesting to know who's in the room. So just put your hand up if you do face-to-face work with patients. Okay, and put your hand up if you do face-to-face work or have any involvement with families. Okay, that's really helpful. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to talk about early intervention, and I'm also going to talk about the importance of thinking about parents. So we spend a lot of time in my field, in substance misuse, thinking about the drug. What is the drug? How is it taken? How long has it been taken? Is someone dependent? Is someone harmfully using? All these questions that psychiatrists like myself think about. We then also often talk about the individual. What's their social circumstance? Do they have depression? What other genetic factors might be at play? And we sometimes talk about the context. Where are they living? What circumstance or trauma have they experienced that's brought them to their drug problem? But one of the things we tend to miss, in my experience, is thinking about a wider family context. And in particular, I think we often forget, particularly with younger users, to think about parents. So let me tell you a little bit about how I came to think about parents. So the first thing was many of my patients are young adults. I specialize in club drugs, things like MDMA and ketamine and novel psychoactive substances. And so many of my patients, or many of the people who use those drugs, are younger. And in the course of meeting these patients over years, what I found was the parents of those patients kept coming and asking me the same questions. So they asked questions such as, can I stop my child from using drugs? Should I talk to them about drugs? Will that encourage them to use drugs if I talk to them? If I talk to them, when should I do that? Should I drug test my child? Very common question I get asked all the time. Should I start drug testing them? And how do I talk about drugs if I don't really know very much about them? So these questions kept coming up and up again and again. And one thing that occurred to me was that parents themselves are an underused resource in helping a young person with a drug problem. We tend to forget about the parents. We tend to say, well, the patient needs their space. They need to have a safe space they can talk about. So we'll exclude the parents completely, and we'll just think about this young person. Now, it's important, of course, that young person has a safe space. But I think sometimes we get the balance a little bit too far one way, and we forget about the importance and the influence that parents can have. Another reason I became interested in this subject was that the Royal College of Psychiatrists in the UK asked me to write a book. They said, you know a lot about parents, you know a lot about drugs, so could you write a book for parents that would also be helpful for staff in terms of thinking about how parents fit in? And so I was thinking, well, okay, I'm happy to do that, but what actually should I say in a book like this? What would be important for people to know? Because, of course, in the same way, all of our clients, all of our patients are very different. Parents are all very different. They've got different sets of problems, different challenges. So the challenge for me was to decide what to put in this book. So here is the book. It was called The Drug Conversation. And the first thing I thought people would need was good quality, accessible information about the drugs, the drug harms, and what it is about being a teenager or an adolescent that makes them so vulnerable to drug use. And I'll talk about that in a moment. I also thought, well, I'll start answering all of these questions. So all of these questions over the years that parents have been asking me, these repeating questions, I thought, well, I better get on and answer some of those. Books can be a bit boring if they're just very theoretical. So I decided to put in lots of examples from my own clinical experience, obviously anonymized. But I also, and most importantly, wanted to have a section to try and help parents have a conversation about drugs with their children. And not just when they were having a drug problem, but earlier on before they were having a problem. Because I have a theory that earlier conversations with children before they have a problem may actually prevent problems from developing. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So, why should you encourage parents to have a conversation about drugs? Well, parents' views do matter to their children. Good communication, as we know, is crucial. And we also know that information influences choice. And of course, with drugs, if you think about what teenagers learn about drugs, there's a huge amount of misinformation that young adolescents are given about drugs from the internet, from their friends, from dealers. And so is there some way to perhaps balance that information up to make it a little bit more accurate? Now, one of the things that people tend to say is, well, what's the point of having a conversation with your child? Children don't listen to their parents anyway. Well, let's look at the research. This is where 15 to 24-year-olds get information about drugs. This is European data. So by far the most common place people go for is the internet, perhaps not surprisingly. The next most common is a friend. After that is a health professional, but not far behind actually is a parent or a relative. So I want to sort of challenge this myth that parents don't matter because children don't listen to them anyway. The research suggests that actually children do listen to their parents. So then I started to think, well, if you're going to help a parent have a conversation with their child, what might be some of the do's and perhaps as importantly some of the don'ts in actually having that conversation? So these are some of the things that I concluded with, and I'd be very interested to know whether people would agree with these or not. The first thing, don't think it all has to be done in one conversation. Secondly, set the scene. Prepare your child that this is a conversation that you're going to start. Do think about whether one parent or in fact both parents should be there. For younger children, it can be quite intimidating sometimes to have two parents sitting there. So it might be choosing one parent might be better. Or in families where parents have divorced, again, who's the right person to have that conversation? Be clear what the conversation is about. The number of parents who start on this conversation and within 30 seconds have sort of got a bit nervous and started talking about something else. Very easy to get blown off course and end up going to more sort of comfortable, familiar territory. Be consistent, be calm, and listen. Don't accuse. So these conversations can be quite difficult, particularly with mid-teens and late teens. And the children will be very, very clear if they're being accused of something. They'll be very vulnerable to that. And don't interrogate. So this conversation is not about interrogating your child to find out what they've been up to. It's about opening communication channels and giving pointers to good quality information. Don't claim ignorance or pretend to know everything. So I've had parents at both ends. I've had parents who go, well, I used loads of drugs when I was young. I know everything about drugs. And of course, the drug scene has changed very rapidly. And so they don't, but they think they do. And that can be quite off-putting. At the other end of the spectrum, if people go, well, I've never touched a drug and drugs are awful and, you know, I don't know anything about them. Well, your child could quite reasonably say, well, why are you talking to me about drugs if you don't know anything about them? Give information, probably the most important thing. If you don't know information, don't know where to get the information, that I put in the book lots and lots of sources where you can direct people towards good quality information. The most important thing your child can do is have a range of different information to go to so they can begin to balance and make some choices. Don't forget alcohol. So although the book was around drugs, alcohol is obviously the most commonly used psychoactive drug. But most parents are more familiar talking about alcohol. Make sure you leave time for questions. Be prepared for tricky questions. Now, what's the question that every parent's going to be asked if they start talking to their child about drugs? Of course. Have you, Mum, Dad, have you done drugs? So the parent needs to prepare for that. Because the last thing they want to do is go, leave the door open for further conversation. And most importantly, finish with praise. These are complicated, difficult conversations, and it's really important, however well or poorly the conversation goes, that you finish with praise. I mean, the analogy is it's a bit like talking about sex. It's a bit like having the conversation about sex. It's a sort of acutely embarrassing conversation for both sides, but it's a very important conversation, and it's just one that needs to get done. So when should you think about having this conversation? Well, in my view, the way to do this is to start before the child has been exposed to drugs or to people who are using drugs. And in my view, that's usually about 10 to 12 years old. And that, I think, is about the perfect time, depending a little bit on the maturity of the child. So if your child's very immature, maybe you'd leave it a little bit longer. If they're very mature, you might even start a bit earlier. But 10 to 12 is when they'll start hearing in the school playground about drugs. And so that, in my view, is a good time for them to start beginning to hear from their parents about it. So I mentioned at the beginning there are some very common, frequent questions I get asked by parents. And I just want to pick on a few of these and just talk through what the evidence base is behind some of the questions. So the first question I get asked is, well, is adolescent drug use normal? You know, is it actually a rite of passage that, you know, teenagers, they'll all try a joint or they'll all, you know, try something or other, and it's just should be accepted and not worried about too much? Well, let's have a look what the data shows. So globally, between the ages of 50 and 64, how many people do you think have tried an illicit drug in the last year? One in how many? 1 in 100, 1 in 10, 1 in 50? So this is adults, 15 to 64. 1 in 6, 1 in 4, 1 in 2? This is in the last year. Wow. 1 in 20. I don't know where you lot live. You obviously live in very drug-infested areas of Brussels. Okay, the mean streets of Brussels. Okay. So I'm going to give some UK data because I don't have the data from Belgium. But in the UK, so if globally 1 in 20, what do you think it is? 1 in how many in the UK? We love our drugs, by the way, in the UK. We've got quite high prevalence rates. Just to give you an idea, we should go higher or lower. How many? 1 in? 10. 1 in 12. Now, that's for adults. Let's now start thinking about younger people. So what about young people in the UK, 16 to 24? 1 in? 1 in 3? 1 in 6? 1 in 5? Yeah. So 1 in 5 young people between that age has used a drug in the last year. And let's just look at some US data. So this is Monitoring the Future, which is a very sort of established research project in the US. So if they just look at 15-year-olds in the US, how many do you think? One in how many do you think? Someone's got the answer with their fingers. 1 in 3, and they're celebrating. Well done. Okay. All right, so what age do people first start trying a drug? Now, this is all very interesting because the next 2 slides show how different drugs come in and out of use at different ages. So I don't know if you can see these from the back. So it's the bars are, it's 11 years, 12, 13, 14, and 15 years. The black bars are volatile substances. So that's glue, essentially glue sniffing. And then the grey bars are cannabis. So what you can see is you get a little peak in the black at about 13, and then it descends. So that's the first drug people tend to use, is solvents. It's a bit of glue sniffing. Peaks around 13, 14, and then drops away. But what you do see is you see this dramatic increase in the cannabis. Hardly anybody using at 13. By 14, it's really creeping up. By 15, really quite a few people have tried it. So that's 15%. So that's the early years. If we now move a little bit further forward, so these now, you've got 16 to 19, 20 to 24, 25 to 29, so it's every 5 years, 30, 35, 40, 45, taking you right up to 60. Now, the bars are different here. So the black is cocaine. The very light grey is ecstasy, MDMA, and the darker grey is cannabis. And what you can see is the cannabis peaks in late teens, the MDMA peaks in the early 20s, and the cocaine peaks in the late 20s. So what you have is the popularity of different drugs coming and going along the age course. And that's really important in terms of thinking about what education people need at different ages, because they're using different drugs at different ages. Okay. Treatment response. Now, I find this slide absolutely fascinating. So, if you look at the treatment success of people under 18 years old, the treatment success if you look at most programs, is around 80%. If you look at the treatment success of people over 18, so 18 to 60, the treatment success is 30%. Now, there's lots of different ways you can think about these data. These 2 groups are largely using different drugs. So the earlier group are largely just using cannabis. The older group are largely using heroin. So they're different drugs, but there's something very important to me about the difference that we've got in terms of outcome between the younger and the older group. The neurobiology of this is very interesting because the longer you use drugs, the more damage you do to your cognitive function. And actually that may make you less available to benefit from treatment. So the message I take from this slide is early intervention is really, really important. Because actually if you can get in early, then you're much more likely to get treatment success. The next question I often get asked is, can I tell if my child is using drugs? How can I tell? And again, I don't expect you to be able to read all of this at the back. The slides can be circulated. But essentially what it's got one bar that shows the signs of puberty, and the next column shows the signs of possible drug use. And the first thing that's striking is that these columns are pretty similar. So whether you're looking at physical effects, psychological effects, or social effects, there's a big overlap between the sort of behaviors that you see in a stroppy adolescent and a person who's using drugs in adolescence. And so it's quite a hard thing to untangle. But there are some clues. So there are some drug-specific physical signs. Things like sores around the mouth, damage to the nose, injection marks. Obviously, that's a very serious sign. There are some psychological clues. So things like if your child's cutting, burning, unpredictable behavior, those are the sorts of things that are a little bit extreme for just adolescents. And then the social changes. So parents finding too much money or too little money on their child, stealing, talking about drugs on social media. Parents often come and go, my child has a Bob Marley poster in their bedroom. I'm very worried. And it's like, well, okay, what does that mean? Does it mean that they're buying cannabis and they're dealing cannabis, or does it mean they like reggae? And, there's not an easy answer, but it's something to try and help a parent think through. The next question I often get asked is, what about all the new drugs? I don't know anything about them. And so parents will often come and say, yeah, well, I know a little bit about cannabis, because that was around when I was a student, that was around when I was young. But these legal highs and this ketamine stuff and this ecstasy, I don't know anything about that. And so one way to try and help parents think about drugs is to try and think about them broadly in terms of 3 or perhaps even 2 groups. So the first is traditional classical drugs. So those are the ones that most parents will have heard of: heroin, crack cocaine, benzodiazepines, cannabis, alcohol. Then you've got some of the newer, what are often called club drugs. So the ketamine, the GBL, the MDMA, mephedrone, synthetic cannabis, these sorts of drugs. And then you've got this rapidly evolving group of novel psychoactive substances, which come and go from the market really very quickly and have been a huge problem in the UK, actually. And sometimes we can think about these as sort of emerging drug trends. Now, again, I'm going to show you a little bit of UK data, but I just want to show you the number of people who are coming into treatment for drug treatment under 25 years old. So the top line is heroin, essentially. The second line is heroin and crack cocaine. And the third line is just crack cocaine on its own. And it goes from 2010 up to 2015, so a 5-year period. And the first thing that really stands out is it is all going down, which is great news, isn't it? Less young people are using heroin, less young people are having problems with heroin, less young people are needing to come in and get treatment for heroin in the UK. Heroin is not fashionable with young people, in the UK at least. And so we've seen a halving of the number of people who are having problematic heroin use in under 25s. Good news. But there are some exceptions to this trend. So again, if we look at treatment data from 2010 to 2015, again, this is UK, and I apologize for it being so UK-centric. We can see that ecstasy, I don't have a pointer, so this is ecstasy here. This is ketamine there. And the one that's really bucking the trend is this one. And those are novel psychoactive substances, which in the UK for a long time were called legal highs. So they're things that are often purchased off the internet, often sold in so-called head shops, synthetic versions of traditional drugs. And this is what's happened with these new drugs. So again, this is European data now. So these are the number of new drugs that the EMCDDA, that's the European Monitoring Centre on Drugs and Drugs Abuse, has detected each year. So back in 2005, 6, 7, a handful, a dozen at the most each year, a dozen new chemicals would find their way onto the European drug market. And then in 2010, something happened. And we saw then a year-on-year increase to a peak in 2014 where there were 101 new psychoactive substances released onto the European drug market in a single year. That's 2 a week. That's a lot of new drugs. It's beginning to tail off now, actually, as the market stabilizes. But the EMCDDA is now monitoring 620 new psychoactive substances. Now, this is pretty challenging for me as a clinician because I've rather comfortably gone through much of my career thinking, well, I need to know about 4 or 5 different drugs. I need to know about heroin, benzodiazepines, cocaine, alcohol, cannabis. That's probably all I need to know, and I can get away with knowing that. Now suddenly I've got 620 new drugs. So that's quite challenging because these drugs are often poorly understood. We don't really know the harms. We don't know how people use them. We don't know which people are using them. We don't know in what way they're being used. Help's at hand in a way because you can't know about 600 drugs. It's impossible. So instead what we need to know about is we need to know broadly what effect that drug has. And in doing that, there are really only 3 broad psychoactive effects. Things are stimulant, things are sedative, or things are hallucinogen. You will see there's an extra purple box here that has synthetic cannabinoids on. That's sometimes called spice. What's it called in Belgium? Do you have synthetic cannabinoids? Yeah, what do you call them? They're called spice or? They're called what? Synthetic cannabis, yeah, okay, thank you. These have to have their own box because they're so diverse, chemically diverse, and their psychoactive effects are so diverse that they can be all of the other 3 groups mixed together. So they're in a separate box. And these are some of the drugs that fit in to those 3 groups, well, 4 groups. Now, I mentioned about drug testing. A lot of parents really do like drug testing. They feel it gives them a sense of control over a situation. It feels that they've sort of put some sort of boundaries down with their child. It feels that they're negotiating some way forward. But one of the problems is that none of these new drugs show up on a standard drug screen. So these drug screens are great for cannabis and cocaine. They're great for heroin. They're useless for these 600 new drugs. They just won't help. And that's a challenge to parents who think they can drug test their way out of a drug problem. They can't. Another question I get asked is, when should I take my child to see a specialist? Very common question, is this a problem? Is this a big enough problem to seek help? The child's going, I don't want help. I'm absolutely fine, Mum. There's no problem here. Everybody's doing it. I'm using the same as my friends. And the parent's like, well, hang on a minute. Is this a problem or is this not? So these are some of the things that I tell parents are definitely problematic and would definitely warrant referral to a specialist. Some of them are obvious. Injecting. If the child's injecting, there's something very significant going on. They're using a Class A drug. Now, that's a UK term, but essentially it's cocaine, heroin, those sorts of drugs. That needs specialist help in a young person. If the child asks for help, so sometimes I see children who are desperate to change their behaviours around drugs, but feel trapped in a system that may be around bullying, it may be about drugs being a key to certain social groups, and they don't want to lose those social connections. Suicidal thinking or repeated deliberate self-harm. Psychosis, so drug-induced psychosis absolutely needs referring. Extreme risk-taking, be that sexual or things like driving under the influence. Physical violence, and I'm always amazed actually at the level of violence that parents will tolerate from their children. It's, I'm sure you all do, hear shocking stories of parents who are sort of tolerating incredibly violent behaviour from their children because they just are paralysed, they don't know where to go with it. Existing mental health problems, so if the child's already got a diagnosis of depression, previous problems with drugs and alcohol. So if this is a recurring problem, this is now happening for a second time, again, I think that's a specialist referral. A strong family history, so very strong genetic loading. parents are unable to communicate with the child. So again, those of you who work with families, you will have no doubt come across the situation where the parents and the children are not communicating at all. It's just completely broken down. They're unable even to have basic, meaningful communication. Rapid deterioration in academic, social, and emotional functioning. Again, I think that would be a good way a good reason to refer on. Okay, so what am I really saying? Let's see if I can summarize what I've said in the last half an hour. I believe that parents are an underused resource in helping younger people tackle drug problems. I believe that early conversations will help destigmatize issues around drugs and might well prevent later problems occurring by making them easy to deal with if they arise. If drugs are a problem, most parents are absolutely desperate to get help, but they often really struggle to know where to go and what to do. But they're often not very good at asking for help. And finally, I think prevention and early intervention is an opportunity in adolescent drug use that I don't think we are fully appreciating. At the moment, we tend to put most of our resources into people who have established drug problems. We wait until they've been using heroin for, on average, 7 years before people come into treatment in the UK. And it's a similar sort of timescale for other drugs too. So we wait until the problem is really entrenched, and then we try and sort the problem out. And I do think a model of earlier intervention around substance misuse, which is very well established in other diseases, other mental health problems, asthma, diabetes, you look at all these other health conditions, and early intervention is just an accepted, normal part of the treatment paradigm. But I think for substance misuse, we're still struggling to find a way to deliver early intervention in a successful way. Now, I'm going to stop there because there's a huge amount of expertise in this room, and I'd much rather have a conversation with you than me sort of just talk to more slides. So let me stop talking at you, and let's start having a conversation. So who has any comments or questions on anything I've said? This is the bit where you have to put your hand up and ask questions.
Okay. Hello. Thank you very much. Again, I'm Philippe Cavros. I'm a psychologist for the Promise Group, and I run the French program at one of their clinics. Something that came to my mind is like I would add is parents need to be helped before they can help their kids.
Yeah.
They, parents with kids suffering from substance abuse are pretty messed up themselves, and to do their parental function, they also need support and help. That's something that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. So the point is that the parents themselves need a therapeutic approach, and I couldn't agree more. Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Mimi Lefevre from the Promise Group, and I'm here with my husband, who is in recovery. We have 2 daughters. Sorry, darling. We have 2 daughters. They're quite young at the moment, 11 and 8? Oh, sorry. 7.
You should know that.
Sorry. 11 and 7. And I think they're fine at the moment because I tend to observe them a lot because of Dad. I'm not an addict. So my question is, if ever, and I knock on wood, something happens, I don't think it would be nice for me to go to Dad and say, listen, you need to speak to one of the girls, for example, do I need to go to one of the other clinics, or do I need to go to one of my colleagues? Oh, how do I approach that? Because I'm very strict, I'm very direct, and I'm not patient.
And what you said is really important. As a parent, you're not there as a professional, you're not there as a therapist, you're not there as even a person who may or may not have used drugs. You're there as a parent. And that's a very specific role with specific boundaries. And the better the communication you have with your children, the more likely they are to come and say if they've got a problem. Yeah? So opening those communication channels, I believe, is very, very critical to what happens next. Now, our children, for those of you who have children, they will inevitably be exposed to drugs at some point. It's just impossible for them not to be. It may not be drugs right in front of them on a table, but it will be people talking about drugs, it'll be drugs in a movie. It's impossible for them to get away from it. And there's a huge amount of misinformation out there. And so anything you can do to direct them towards something that's sensible and will sort of perhaps rebalance a little bit what they're hearing elsewhere has to be a good thing. Because at the end of the day, your children will have no doubt at some point be offered drugs, and they'll have to make a decision whether, am I going to do that, am I not going to do that? Now, some of that will be based on their own moral code, moral values, their own resilience at saying yes or no to things, their own self-esteem in terms of being able to say, well, what do I want? But actually the other thing that's important is them having some information about what the relative risks are. So it's not any good as a parent going in and going, ooh, don't ever touch ecstasy, it kills people. Because actually your children will look around and see lots of people taking ecstasy who aren't dying. What you've got to do is tread a much more complicated line, which is saying some of these drugs are harmful. These are the things that could actually really increase your risk. And if possible, for your children, try and make that risk personal to them. So, for example, if they have a genetic history in their family, if they've got a relative who has had a problem with substances, that's important information for your child to know, because it does increase their risk if they then choose to use substances. So that's critical. Their risk is not the same as someone who's got a family tree with no history of any sort of addiction or mental health problems. And I think we just have to have these honest conversations. We have to pick the age. 11 is too early. Yeah. But at 15, it might be really important to have an honest conversation about the individual risk that a particular child has. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Kasia and I'm a general practitioner and practicing in Brussels. In the past, I used to work in a substance misuse service in the UK.
Okay.
And my approach as a doctor is always about harm reduction as well. So when you educate your parents that they should educate their children,
yeah.
How do you put that advice in place? Because obviously it's about safe using and needle exchange in case of injectable drugs, but also about using with somebody and somebody knowing about their use. Harm reduction is, I can talk for longer, but the key point is it's very hard for me as a general practitioner to tell the parents because they don't understand harm reduction and it takes a lot of time. When do you give them that advice and how do you do it?
Yeah. That's a very good question, very complicated question, actually. So the starting point is not to try and impose anything on the parents. The parents often have their own views. Some will be so anti-drugs that the whole concept of harm reduction will be just too difficult and they won't accept it. They'll just go, I don't want my child using drugs. I'm not going to tell them how to use drugs safer. I don't want them to use drugs. And they will absolutely not budge an inch. Other parents will go, well, if they're going to use something, then I want them to use it as safely as possible. I'm not comfortable with it, but I'd rather them use safely than use dangerously. So you've got to judge what the parent's going to accept. And I think with the first group of parents, the ones who are absolutely refusing any sort of harm reduction, it's quite hard to have that conversation. You can say, well, these are some of the things that have been shown to make drug use safer. They might be the sorts of things you want to direct your child to. But some parents really won't have that, and they won't pass that message on, and they won't accept that message. And at that point, you just have to say, okay, well, I'll get as far as I can with that parent, but I have to work within what they're happy to accept. These conversations can be very, very difficult, but also very rich, and actually coming back to the point that was made a bit earlier about the parents often having issues that they need to manage themselves. It can often be a sort of helpful way into a broader conversation about supporting and getting support. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Alessia Chandra, consultant psychiatrist, and work in London and in Brussels now. I just wonder, Owen, just one question that just popped into my mind, but at what stage in treatment do you offer a family assessment, if you do offer a family assessment? And then the other question is, when a child, when an adolescent is using drugs, and the family is open to talk about safe use, and they, one of the questions I often get asked is, can he use in the house? Is that a safer way, really, for our kids to use? And next thing is that they actually start using in the house, and how family address that.
Yeah. So,
thank you.
So 2 questions there. So the first question is about family therapy. So in the Club Drug Clinic in London, where I work, we introduced both couples and family therapy very early. So it's on offer right from the front door. Because we find that the sooner you engage the broader family unit, the better. It needs to be done, so just we get on with it. There are some quite interesting conversations about consent and what stays in one room and doesn't go to another room, and that can be very interesting and sometimes quite challenging, but we usually find a way through it. We find a way that everyone's agreeable to. In terms of harm reduction, so there is this, again, really complicated sort of seesaw between what's harm reduction and what becomes enabling. And parents sometimes come to me in a situation where they've become entirely enabling of their child's drug use. So they're letting their child not only use in the house, but they're going and buying drugs for the child. And they're picking up needles for them in the needle exchange. And the thing has got sort of out of control. And so one of the things I try and do with parents, I say, well, what would be the absolute red lines that you should have around substance misuse? And often they come up with their own red lines, but when they can't, I sometimes help them towards red lines. And the sort of ones that I commonly help people to is violence. Red line, no violence in the house, so that's something that can't be tolerated. Drug use, I tend to say people shouldn't be using drugs in the house. You get parents to go, well, if they're not using in my house, then they're going to be using in the street, or they're going to be using in their friend's house. And it's a tortuous situation for a parent to have the child out there somewhere where they don't know, and they often would prefer it to be going on in the house. But to be honest, it gets into, in my experience at least, it tends to get into really pretty sticky situations once the parents are allowing children to use drugs in the house. Because what tends to happen is then all their friends come around, and before they know it, the parents have sort of got a de facto drug den going on. And then they sort of lose control of the situation, and then they don't know what's going on. There's dealing going on in the house, and before they know it, they've got the police kicking down the front door, and the whole thing is, could have been avoidable. So I think helping some parents realise what their boundaries are and what their red lines are is often, I find, the best way to start this conversation. But it's really complicated, and it can take quite a lot of thinking with parents to get them to a position where they find this balance between not enabling drug use, but also trying to help their child, if they're continuing to use drugs, to be as safe as possible. Does that answer your question? Partly.
No, it does. But I mean, I think with adolescents and cannabis really is like, it's very, very difficult. Because I think, cannabis is softer drugs, and very often adolescents, feel safer using at home because they don't have to go out and they buy it outside, but then they actually very often push or come home. So it's, I often find parents really coming and complaining, oh, well, but now the house smells of cannabis. Just really very common. And really comes also down to, the service availability and in terms of, offering family therapy. So you think really kind of how quickly can you do that and how available that service is. Yes, independent psychiatrists, it's perhaps easier to set up, but then when you think about in terms of community availability of service and public services in terms of offering assessment for families, how easy is that?
Well, I think the starting point is that drug use is not an individual's problem. It's not an individual problem. It's at its smallest step, it's a family problem. And it's often a bigger problem than that. It involves more people. But, substance abuse doesn't just involve the individual who's using the drug. You have to start right from the beginning, in my view, thinking about all the other people who are part of this sort of broadened social network that the person's connected to. Okay, I think we've got time for maybe one last question. Yeah, just down here.
Hello, my name is Prishni and I work as a clinical psychologist in Brussels. Thank you for the nice presentation. I just had a thought, so it's not just to put a little thought out there. Maybe like in other problems that we see with different clients, the drug issue is a symptom. And maybe we have to start addressing the cause. So like you have in eating disorders and other disorders, sometimes it's nice to have one specialist handling the drug issue and you have another specialist who handles the causes. So then you don't have the parental pressure which comes where they say, I want my son or daughter to stop using. So you can clearly tell the parent, I will not handle that symptom. For that, you go and see your GP or the drug specialist. I'm going to handle the causes of what's leading the child to do that. And sometimes when you remove that pressure, the therapist also gets time to work with the cause. Maybe that's an approach that might be helpful when you have to see parents, because parents, I can understand, you get very concerned and you want it to stop right away, and that becomes too much of a pressure on the people helping out in the situation.
So the sort of approach I use to parents about why people are using drugs, because actually you're quite right, this is the critical question. The drug use itself is very often a symptom of something else. But broadly speaking, people take psychoactive drugs for two reasons. They use it to get feelings that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have. So they take a stimulant and they dance all night and that's amazing. Or they take drugs to take away feelings that they don't want. And broadly speaking, I think you can put almost all drug use into one of those two categories. Now, parents find that quite helpful because then they can sort of get beyond this, oh my God, my child is using drugs, and begin to think about, well, what's the motivation for using? Now, I don't particularly, I'm a bit unsure about this idea of different people doing different things, because I think there is a slight danger that you can fragment treatment that way. And when either the adolescent or the parents come in, what they tend to really benefit from is a sense that there's a team, and that team is sort of all one, and that team, across the team, understands the whole problem from all the perspectives, and that they talk and they act as a team. And so, as a psychiatrist, I don't really see my role as titrating people onto methadone or detoxing people off benzodiazepines. I very much see my role as that bit about, well, why did this start in the first place, and what is going on underneath that needs addressing? Is this a symptom of distress, this drug use, or is it a symptom of someone who's wanted to get high and it sort of got out of control and they became physiologically dependent? So I sort of feel that a good drug service should actually be able to hold the whole thing. And I do think that parents are a bit more contained and patients are a bit more contained when they feel that there's a sort of team around them that is holding it all, rather than they go that way to the GP for that and this way for this. So that's my own personal opinion. But, you know, services are configured very differently. You know, even in my small part of London, they're all configured differently. But that would be the ideal team for me.
I agree with you on that. And I think that's right for the ones that are very severe and where you have the first, when they come in with it at a minor level. So then I agree the service should be covered by one organization.
Great. So we finished on complete agreement, which is always a good way. Oh no, we're about to have...
Okay. A last one. Sorry.
Are you going to disagree?
It's you know, I work in a treatment center, and you know, on your point that parents are underused, and in treatment center, I often observe that parents are part of the problem. Mm-hmm. And the kids, the teenagers, they have very strong resentments towards the parents, and it's actually, you know, a time to temporarily, you know, get the parents or one parent out of the way for a period of time. So when you when this is about kids, how do you deal with this?
So the way I deal with it, I mean, I agree. Sometimes there's very complicated dynamics between the child and their parents, or child and one parent, or between the two parents, or between the sibling. You know, it can get very, very complicated. But I still like to think of it as a system. And the moment you kick things out of that system, then you're not really dealing with the system anymore. And so I do think, although you may have therapeutic boundaries between, put down therapeutic boundaries between a child and a particular member of their family, as the sort of the person overseeing the care, you still need to think about it holistically. Because even if if one parent is perhaps, I don't know, particularly narcissistic or particularly destructive in the way that they treat other people, if you exclude them from the treatment plan, well, things will probably get better, absolutely. But then when they go home, the parent's still there and nothing's been addressed around those behaviours. So I find it's much better to do that really quite difficult, challenging work with everybody involved, because I just think you're more likely to get a good result if you tackle the really tough stuff.
Sorry, Owen, is it okay to just pop in with one quick comment?
Can I just check?
You still have 5 minutes.
You've got 5 minutes. Okay, all right.
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you, Owen. Okay. I know I need your card later, obviously, for my 2 younger daughters, so thank you for that. But I'd just like to stand up for the parents for a second, because I think in clinics what we hear very often from the clients is that they're frustrated by their controlling spouses or their controlling parents. And of course what we're experiencing are the people who've been trying to rein in chaotic behaviour. And I think it's all too easy in the clinic to fall into this trap of siding with the client and saying, oh yes, of course you're using because you've got all these controlling people around you. Well, if someone's got controlling people around them, there's probably a reason why they've needed that. So I do believe that we have to have a sort of systemic solution which does include everybody. You might have to have a brief period where you work with an individual, but as quickly as possible. And I would say most of our health system, mental health system, seems to be geared exactly against that. That it seems to be totally focused on these sort of one-to-one relationships, which I think seems so naive when we understand the nature, or if we understand the nature of this problem more fully. Mm-hmm. So I hope in 20 years' time that'll be something that'll be the most different. But anyway, I thought I'd stand up for the parents for a second, because I do think they get a bad rap. Thank you very much for your very interesting talk.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Declan. I'm European Director of Services with Connections in Recovery. And part of what we do is aftercare and helping the client make transition back into the real world. And So absolutely creating a team, which must absolutely include their family, is part of what we do. And there are occasions when the family excludes itself. And so I guess my question is to you and the whole room, what are your answers when that happens, when the family is not willing to participate? It's really tough for the client to have long-term recovery when that happens.
Well, I think we've all got the skills to do this because most people in this room, I suspect, will have been trained with motivational interviewing techniques.
Sure.
You roll with the resistance. So if the parents are not prepared to talk about drug use or they don't want to talk about their child, you start talking to them about something else. And you keep them engaged, even if they are not, not prepared to do the thing that you really want them to do, which is focus on the problem. Because actually, sooner or later, this family unit, in most family units, do need to find some sort of resolution. I mean, occasionally you see family units that just splinter and go their separate ways. But that tends to leave a lot of unfinished business for people. And those sort of unresolved conflicts that occur when families totally split and go in different directions, that can cause trouble for years. So it's much better, if possible, to try and see if you can sort of shepherd people along together, even if they're not really perhaps having the conversations you want them to. So I'd advocate rolling with resistance and just moving them, keeping them engaged, but perhaps moving to safer territory for them. I don't know, what would other people think? Everybody agrees with me. This is fantastic.
Well, with this, Owen, thank you so much.